With the end of World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union became the world's leading superpowers, and they were backed by their allies along with their vast militaries. Around this time, and the division of Europe, the tensions between East and West were rising, fueled by the mistrust of the other. These came to the head during the occupation of Germany, where Berlin was divided in half, with three Western zones, and the Soviet zone, which was in the Soviet half of Germany, had been split in half. The Soviets wanted to stop the Western plans of rebuilding Germany economically and to make Germany and other countries such as Poland and Hungary into satellite states as a buffer between the West and the US's home turf. Additionally, there were ideological differences between communism and capitalism, which directly caused countries to mistrust each other. In a time of rising tensions between the Eastern and Western powers, the Western powers started to introduce a new German currency without the Soviet approval. In 1948, they set up a blockade of the Western zones in Berlin to prevent the West from moving supplies into the area by land. The Western allies didn't want to risk a military confrontation with the Soviets by sending a convoy, and ultimately began the Berlin airlift, using planes to fly in supplies. And with their plans of starving out the Western powers not working, the Soviets lifted their blockade in 1949. Between the two Germanys, East and West Germany, Western Germany was backed by the Western Alliance, soon to be called NATO, or North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Many citizens in Eastern Germany fled to the West, which grew tensions between the East and the West, so much so that there was a wall set up in Berlin in 1961. Once NATO was founded, the Soviets were seeking a countermeasure, so they formed the Warsaw Pact, made of the communist puppet states that had been set up in the aftermath of World War II. The threat of the other power caused these two organizations to build up in military arms, which caused an arms race, especially at the end of World War II, had brought around nuclear technology, which was thought to be the weapon of the future. During this time, several proxy wars between the allies of NATO and Warsaw Pact, such as the Korean War and Vietnam War, were happening, in which NATO had directly involved in these conflicts, with the Warsaw Pact either directly supplying or fighting in the wars. Both of these had the goal of spreading or preventing the spread of communism in those countries. The event that almost caused World War III was the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, which had the USSR put missiles in Cuba similar to what the US had done in Turkey, which in goal was to be able to quickly send nuclear missiles to strategic targets before retaliation. This problem was solved by diplomatic means, which started a time of improved relations between NATO and the Warsaw Pact. The dangers of the nuclear war were highlighted by the Cuban Missile Crisis, which led to a nuclear bomb test ban between the Warsaw Pact and NATO, limiting the amount of bombs and missiles that could be tested. The time period was highlighted by discontent in the communist-controlled countries due to the repressive regime and harsh conditions imposed. Revolutions such as the Prague and Hungarian revolutions demonstrated the brutality of how the Soviets repressed the revolutions and called for more reforms, including the severing of direct control from Moscow. Additionally, the USSR could not compete against the United States and NATO in an arms race, and economically, which led to the USSR becoming economically strained than stagnant, where they were having trouble feeding their population, so much so that the United States started to provide food help to the Russians, but later stopped due to the Soviet-Afghan War, which humiliated the Russians since they were beat by technologically inferior troops. The Afghan resistance led to hope within the Warsaw Pact nations that they could be free from the USSR. These hopes became reality when the governments of these countries began to be overthrown, and these revolutions led to the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, which led to several new states, with Russia being the strongest, and thus the end of the Cold War. During this time began decolonization. During World War II, the anti-colonial movements became stronger, such as those in India and the Dutch East Indies. In the aftermath of World War II, many major colonial powers were weakened by the war, and much to the point where they determined that it was not worth the time, effort, or money to reclaim the colonies. Additionally, many of these countries' populations had fought in the war and were trained in warfare so that the revolutions would have been very bloody, so one by one, former colonies became independent countries, or in the case of many British colonies, chose to remain part of the British Commonwealth, but be independent countries. This signaled the end of the colonization era. Global trade exploded with the end of the Cold War. The new global economy was part of a renewed emphasis on a market-oriented strategy that advocated by leaders such as Ronald Reagan in the United States and Margaret Thatcher in Great Britain. They advocated cutting taxes, regulations, and government assistance to the poor to promote economic growth. Globalization is interaction between peoples, governments, and companies around the world. The Indian Ocean trade and European imperialism are both examples of globalization. However, the term usually refers to increased integration of the global economy since the 1970s. The Eastern Bloc nations that had been under Soviet control suddenly could trade freely with capitalist democracies. India and other countries that had been non-aligned during the Cold War relaxed restrictions on trade in the 1990s. This opening up of a country's economy is called economic liberalization. Economic liberalization reached China as well. In 1981, Deng Xiaoping became the Chinese leader. Under him, the Communist Party backed away from its commitment to economic equality and more actively promoted economic growth. The government took several steps to open up the economy, even as it kept overall control. Some Chinese thought that these economic reforms should be accompanied by political reforms, such as freedom of speech and the press and the end of the Communist Party's monopoly on political power. Political discourse did become somewhat freer than in the past. In 1989, however, a large but peaceful student-led demonstration in Tiananmen Square in Beijing was met by force from the government. Soldiers using guns and tanks broke up demonstrations, killing hundreds of people. Other countries such as Japan and Finland, along with Latin America, also grew economically during this time. As the economy began to develop in some regions, industrial production and manufacturing in those regions, such as in the United States, have declined. Manufacturing plants are increasingly located in Asia and Latin America rather than the United States and Europe. During this time was the rise of multinational corporations. A multinational corporation is one that is legally incorporated into one country but makes or sells goods or services in more than one country. Joint stock companies of the commercial revolution, such as the British East India Company and the Dutch East India Company, were the earliest examples of multinational corporations. Multinational corporations were also the business means through which imperialist nations made their wealth during the age of imperialism, exploiting the resources and labor of colonialized regions for profit in home countries. By the 1990s, mobile technologies such as cell phones had put the tools of information and creation into the hands of individuals around the world. Twitter, Facebook, and other social networking sites made media accessible to anyone anywhere. The impact of this revolution became apparent quickly. Video, taken on phones of police action in the United States and other countries, led to inquiries into racial profiling and sparked outrage. Social media also played a role in the Arab Spring, a time of anti-government protests that spread from one country in North Africa and the Middle East in the 2010s as people shared their protest experiences on social media. Also globalization during the 20th century, the Green Revolution emerged as a possible long-term response to hunger. Scientists developed new varieties of wheat, rice, and other grains that had higher crop yields and greater resilience to pests, diseases, and drought. New varieties were first developed by crossbreeding two different varieties of a plant to create a hybrid. More recently, scientists have used genetic engineering, manipulating into a cell or organism to change its basic characteristics. Farmers also used more irrigation, fertilizers, and pesticide. In Berlin and elsewhere, other people burned down forests and plowed land for agriculture. Acreage devoted to crops, especially grain, increased dramatically worldwide. Although many thought of it as a good idea, the Green Revolution solutions were not free of all problems. Many small farmers could not afford the new fertilizers or pests. For this reason, they are often unable to compete with large landowners. Many small farmers were forced to sell their land, increasing the holdings of large landowners even more. Also, since some of the techniques developed during the Green Revolution involved the use of mechanized equipment, fewer jobs were available for farm laborers. Finally, the heavy applications of chemicals damaged the soil and the environment. In response to this, many people became more concerned about the state of climate change and resource depletion. In response, many changes were undertook, such as the active reduction of carbon emissions, new renewable sources of energy, like power and solar wind. Additionally, many diseases and epidemics were happening, such as hives and AIDS, which are STDs, Ebola and polio. In response, many new medications were made, such as new heart transplants to solve heart disease, vaccines to prevent diseases, and new forms of reliable birth control and near eradication of diseases such as measles and smallpox. But now some people are bringing that back, anti-vaxxers. These led to the spread of technology between nations as cures and the ways they made them were shared between countries to prevent diseases. This is the end of my video on the Cold War, decolonization, and globalization.